Kia ora koutou e whānau. It is very good to be with you, and very good to see a number of familiar faces and also a number of familiar names for those of you who don't have your camera on. I hope you can all hear me okay. I just got a flash up that my internet connection is a little bit unstable, just as a flash of lightning went off outside my window. So hopefully hopefully that's not something interfering with the Wi-Fi. About some of the things that are going on with young adults, and particularly around leadership formation in Aotearoa for Christian leadership. So one of the real blessings and joys of my job is I get to travel around the country and talk to hundreds, if not thousands of people a year who are seeking to follow God's calling in different ways and looking to do work to prepare themselves. And that look almost anything from studying the Bible to pursuing a particular vocational calling, to taking time out to wrestle with deep questions on behalf of their faith or their church or a community, or doing any kind of other sort of preparation. And one of the really exciting things when you get to go around and have these conversations is you get to see the way in which the Spirit is calling up just some extraordinary people across the country. And I think there's great reason to hope for what God is doing for the future of the leadership of this church, but also for the future of the leadership of so many different Christian ministries in Aotearoa, and hopefully beyond. And my observation is that very often we see the Spirit moving and forming particular groups of leaders or networks of leaders, sometimes a generation or 10 or 15 or 20 years before those leaders are needed in terms of the move of the Spirit. So, for example, when the global missions movement going in really significant new ways in the 1810s and 20s, part of what fuels that is that 25, 30 years prior to that, the Sunday school movement had swept through the English-speaking world. And so you'd had this whole new formation of different pipelines of leaders. And I think from sitting in a college as I do, it's very easy to think of the body of Christ in Aotearoa as comprising congregations who tend to be focused on being worshipping, praying, communities and forming people for the work of the gospel, and missions organizations of different stripes, whether that be evangelism or intercultural mission or the work of the relief of poverty or care of creation or all the other good works of the gospel. And colleges sit in service of these different parts of the body in different ways. And one of those is that we're very interested in lifelong and intergenerational formation. So if colleges like Laidlaw and all the other ones that serve the church in Aotearoa do our work well, we'll be preparing people who will continue to be faithful in many decades, but also who are living in ways that their great-grandchildren will continue to be faithful in different ways. And that's very much part of that work of continuing to prepare and encourage and equip the body of Christ in lots of different ways. And I think you see this kind of in the biblical pattern as well, that sense of in many long years of preparation before they actually engage in leadership. So obviously Paul does, David does, Moses does, of course Christ himself, who is so capable with the scriptures and with the law that he can take on the leaders of the temple in debate at the age of 12, still spends another decade and more in preparation before he enters public ministry. And so one of my observations when I look out at the landscape in Aotearoa and many of the challenges facing young people is that sense that we have an increasing need for leaders who have done that kind of long arc preparation, who've dug deep wells and actually taken the time out to do that, not just for the sustainability of their own faith, but also because the church is facing more complex and highly integrated series of challenges. If you think about a church board, as well as pastoral and spiritual and theological wisdom, we need to be forming leaders who cover a range of stripes, but who are able to think about these different areas biblically and out of the gospel and in deep conversation with so much of our increasingly specialized society. And so part of the challenge that we face in seeing that those kind of formational pipelines occur is partly there are a number of relatively recent in historical terms barriers to entry to study that people are facing. Young leaders particularly are often finding that they're being pulled further and further into quite intense vocational pipelines that don't necessarily leave the time for them to do the theological integration that they need to do to be Christian and to be faithful in their work. So often to, for example, groups of young lawyers or young professionals of all stripes, and one of the challenges that they face is that they have to do 3 times as much work as their peers. They have to do their degrees and study and build their careers. They have to think deeply about their faith, and then they have to do that big third block of work, which is actually pull the pieces into a whole and consistent life in which the way they're thinking and doing their legal practice is shaping all of life. And to be honest, the same is true for pastoring or teaching or counselling or all the other areas where we need to increase the numbers of Christian leaders. So that sense of the need for people to be renewed and released by their communities to do that kind of work, but also in a context where if people take even a few years out to do study, it's often at the cost of a house deposit or the cost of starting a family or these other kinds of things. And so one of the things that I'm both deeply encouraged about, but also your prayer for, is many of the young people that we're seeing coming through places like Laidlaw and many of the other theological and Christian colleges are people who are wearing a huge amount of sacrifice in their life. And you see that when we go through something like COVID, that the number of our students who are studying full-time while also running church communities, while also working to support themselves and their families, is actually extraordinarily high. And so things like COVID really layer on the pressure. So prayer for that is really important. Prayer because the level of preparedness that we need for our leaders in the next generation is just going up. So few communities in New Zealand have the kind of resources necessary to free people to do that kind of many-year preparation. And I think the New Zealand Church, for all its many strengths and many innovative things that we do, we don't always think for the long term. So I don't often have conversations with Christian leaders where we talk well about what they and their church and their movement is doing to make sure that in 20 and 30 and 50 years, they're going to have good succession in place. And in a context where it does take many years to form Christian leaders, to disciple them well, to form them, to prepare them, to give them good grounding, it actually does take at least a decade to prepare a person well to lead a church so that they can be sustainable across the course of their life. And that's very, very challenging in a context where fewer communities have the resource to create those kind of mid-rung roles. So, they might be able to afford a pastor, a senior pastor, but maybe not sort of apprentice roles within that. Similarly, obviously, the New Zealand Church is increasingly diverse, and we need church leaders who are not just monolingual and lingual in terms of their cultural expressions of the gospel, but able to move comfortably between different generational cultures, different ethnic cultures, different linguistic, and also different regional and professional cultures. Just unusual and special calls, basically, and it's wonderful when you find them and you get to have these extraordinary conversations. But also very often I'm sitting down with them going, okay, so you're in a country of 5 million people, and I can think of 3 people in the country that you should talk to who share the same set of calling and interest. And we actually need you 3 people to get to meet and connect and support each other because you're essential for that piece of the body of Christ puzzle in 20 years. And so building those kind of conversational networks are really exciting and really challenging. And it's one of the things we're seeing a lot. So from an institutional point of view, speaking, I guess, for the different Christian higher education institutes in the country, we'd really appreciate your prayer for us as we work reasonably collaboratively, but as we do a lot more hybridization and develop different kinds of formational pathways for people. So at Laidlaw, a great proportion of our students are studying full-time or studying part-time while working, and very often getting credit for their work and various other things. So creating different kinds of hybrid approaches that still allow you to do those core things like biblical languages, like formation and discipleship, like thinking about intercultural mission, if they're going into counselling or teaching, like pedagogy or pastoral care and these kind of things. And then just more generally, we live in a very high compliance and just a complex regulatory framework. The education sector in New Zealand is very highly regulated. The government controls the number of students who are able to come through. So this year we turned away a number of students who we would have wanted to enrol. But the caps on funding, the caps on recruitment make it very challenging to manage. And this is sector-wide. So prayer for favour with those who make decisions about the future of our tertiary sector, are really important. We need the theological and Christian colleges to continue to flourish as they have done for a very long time and continue to be excellent, but we need them to continue to be to exist within the wider university and tertiary system in ways that can serve the church. And probably the other specialist thing that I'd request prayer for from an institutional point of view is we too need good people. And it's one of those rare challenges in a country like New Zealand that one of the biggest challenges when I talk to other theological college leaders and others is recruitment. So I often joke that our ideal person who I would want to hire as a lecturer has at least one PhD, preferably two, because they've got a professional PhD and a theological PhD. They've got 10 to 15 years in church and ministry experience. And ideally they're Māori and Pacifica because they're serving Aotearoa's diverse futures. And so that sense of we're looking for unusual people and we need those people to be supported to grow and mature and develop their own paths. So we're doing a huge amount as a sector and as a college to build those pathways. But one of the things we would want to pray for is that the Spirit would keep raising up people who themselves have this calling to form leaders and to teach. There's just not that many people in Aotearoa who are properly qualified to teach things like biblical languages or church history or the intersection of counselling and theology, these kind of things. And they're so essential to the future of the church. We might not notice for 20 years, but in 20 and 30 and 40 years, you've noticed a huge change in the quality of biblical preaching or in the way that we were doing that kind of pastoral work on the ground. So those are a number of prayer points. Prayer for those young people around the country who have a sense of call, a sense of question, and a prompting by the Spirit to deepen their faith and to think through complex issues that we as the body of Christ desperately need them to do. And to form themselves in ways for leadership, that they will be resourced, that they will be equipped and encouraged by their communities, that they will be sent back in ways that are supported. Prayer for the different barriers to keep those people developing in ways that will serve the church, and particularly for those who are facing multiple pressures and balancing different kinds of leadership roles. And then thirdly, just I guess prayer for those of us who seek to navigate this wider cultural moment. We're all it requires leadership. It requires wisdom to be a Christian leader in this context. And I think looking around this particular Zoom call, most of you know this in different ways. But we're continually finding that we have to have very, very, very fruitful conversations about the role that the church can play in renewing Aotearoa and persuading civil servants, industry leaders, sector leaders of the need for Christian institutions like Laidlaw, not just so that we can serve the church, but because we see that the forming of Christian leaders who can go out into the schooling sector or the wider societal sector as utterly transformative for Aotearoa's communities. So, those would be key prayer points from where I'm sitting. And there's so much more I'd love to talk about if anyone wants to stay on afterwards and either ask me questions or talk further. But thank you.